So I wanted to kind of start by introducing Dr. Rutel. He is going to be speaking on sustainability in Oklahoma and the fossil fuel industry. He is the president of the Oklahoma Sustainability Network, a group that is dedicated to pursuing the 3 E's of sustainability for all Oklahomans. OSN serves to connect, educate, and be a catalyst for the improvement of Oklahoma's economy, ecology, and equality. He is also employed as a medical physicist at the OU Health Science Center and OUMC in Oklahoma City, and is working to ensure high image quality and low radiation doses for physicians and patients using medical imaging modalities. His research interests include AI, workflow improvements, nanoparticles, and bomb squad imaging. So without further introduction, I'll let Dr. Rutel start off on his presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Tate. So I have wear many hats, and today I've been asked to talk about sustainability, which is not one of the hats I get to talk about very often. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And this is a little bit about our region, and specifically Oklahoma, and titled today's talk, How Sustainable is Oklahoma's Fossil Fuel Energy Industry? We'll also include some transportation discussion, and we want to consider the Oklahoma's population health under the smokestacks and behind the tailpipes. So let's go ahead and move in. And I want to start with discussing just a little bit of motivation for why we want to talk about these types of topics, specifically in the guise of global warming. And I know that in times tends to be taboo, but there's a lot of research out there, and this actually comes straight from the National Climate Assessment. And from their analysis, it shows that climate changes will cause more erratic weather, some of which we've actually been experiencing recently, but in general will tend to result in more flooding and droughts. And with that kind of weather behavior, without resilience planning, there will tend to be more resource stress. And why is the resource stress important? And that's because one of our resources, specifically one that's used by power production industries, is water. So water demands are going to have stress, again, if we don't plan for future needs and future realities in terms of what we can expect from the earth. So specifically, water demands are going to be generally used by both power production, which currently requires large amounts of water, but also will compete with agriculture and ranching. And with agriculture, as we tend to see these drought type cycles, we're going to see an efficiency drop. So there'll be less water per acre to grow crops. This also can lead to less water for cattle when we look at the ranch production, which can then mean that they and has been done in the past, where herds will be killed off just due to the lack of food, again, due to the agricultural issues of having less water and just less water for the cattle. So this is an important topic, but it's also not equally distributed. So it turns out that those that bear the risks tend to be differentiated by various factors. So a couple I want to highlight include the indigenous population, since we have many of those here in our local area. And as a note, this initial set of slide introductions is for the Great Plains area specifically. So we're not talking about the general aspects of the entire US. We're fairly specific to our area. All right, so the populations that will be the hardest hit includes the indigenous populations, which already tend to be on the edge of resource availability. But with the resource stress, this will also tend to lead to fewer traditional wildlife, which is used for sustenance and for rituals. But indigenous populations are not the only ones that are at risk here. Also, the poorer socioeconomic classes who may rely on hunting and fishing to help supplement their diets due to these smaller animal populations, again, through resource stress. The lower socioeconomic classes also tend to be more sensitive to price increases due to scarcity. And this will come back again when we talk more about the power production. Okay. So before we move on to discussing what I think of sustainability, I did want to move directly into one of our first questions. So let me reshare a different spot. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about what sustainability is. It's a relatively broad topic, and so I'm kind of curious to see what everybody thinks. And I'm going to go ahead and make a link here. I can get that. Trying to multitask. We'll get there. And oh, no, it was direct questions. Let's go to everybody. There we go. All right. So if you go to menti.com, and we'll spend a minute while everybody has a chance to think about that, but I'm curious to see what sustainability means to everybody here in our current session. And I think you can add about 3 words here in this one, and hopefully it'll populate. See if it works. Okay, written responses. There we go. Okay, so we're getting some responses here. It's supposed to be making a word cloud as we get people going here to see what everybody thinks. And so far, we're seeing responsible and resource use. Responsibility seems to be a key word here. So stewardship, recycling. That was kind of fun. I've never used this before, so I'm kind of excited to see this all work out. All right. Cyclical, another good one. Longevity. Excellent. Okay, so it seems like we have responsibilities, stewardship, equity shows up, which is great, and future and clean, and again, responsible shows again. So these are all excellent words to be thinking about when we talk about sustainability. And in fact, I'm going to set up a little brief introduction of sustainability just to give us a framework to do our analysis of the local area. So if you already are familiar with sustainability, then bear with me. It won't take too long, but we're going to go ahead and briefly discuss, at least in the guise of how we've tended to see it here in the state. All right, so sustainability. All right, so generally, from my point of view, sustainability is just closely tied with the idea that we live in a particular way of life. We have a certain level standard of living, and we want that to be available for future generations. So if an activity is going to prevent future generations from having that same standard of living, comforts we enjoy, then generally that activity is not sustainable. Okay, and so then we're going to want to look at mitigating it. So it's a relatively general idea, and so we'll zoom in a little bit here and talk specifically, as Tate had mentioned. We tend to focus on the 3 E's. So we'll go over each one of those just again, so we've got a broad understanding of how we want to talk about our fossil fuels discussion. So the first is ecology. And so this will include environmental concerns, resource management, and biodiversity. But it also includes waste management. So this is where we can see demand side reductions, so getting people to use less, reuse, as you would see in the recycling mantra, and then finally recycling, which tends to be one of the most expensive ways to do it. But again, all these are ways in which we can discuss and help conserve the ecology. The thing is that we have competing aspects in sustainability, and ecology is not the only thing that we should be considering, because while it's important, we have to be realistic. So the second E is economy. And in this case, we want to pragmatically consider the cost of implementation for various ecological and equity plans or changes. So in general, what we're trying to do is promote costs for all aspects of societal impact. This can include now the waste costs, input costs, and pollution costs. And this generated several years ago this a key phrase of cradle to grave thinking, where we weren't just talking about the cost of extracting, but then finally the cost of, once you have those products, what we need to do with them at end of life cycle. All right, so this may also include implementing sort of our newer terminology, which is green accounting measures. And so this is one of the methodologies that we can use to more appropriately evaluate the ecological and economical factors, and generally trying to move away from measures like gross domestic product and towards capturing, both the non-market costs and the cost of using the depletable resources as rates that exceed their rates of generation. So it's not so much that we can't use different types of resources, but we don't want to overuse. So this is commonly talked about now when we discuss overfishing in our fisheries, right? So fishing is okay, but overfishing is basically going to be a non-sustainable type of activity. All right, and the final E of our trio here is equity. And this is important because, as I had mentioned in the assessment, as we were motivating this talk, it turns out that not all classes or groups of people are going to be impacted similarly. And so we would like to identify the socioeconomic disparities and evaluate the disproportionate costs to all of the classes. And then to move that further, we would also like to voice concerns for those that are traditionally unheard, who have traditionally been relegated to non-participation. And that's either due to their socioeconomic standing and therefore considered not important, or the fact that they aren't, giving money to the cause and therefore they aren't promoting resource contribution and don't have a voice. So these are all reasons that we essentially want to help elevate these types of voices to make sure everybody's heard, because some of those voices are going to be very important and may be impacted more closely than others. So one of the ways that I like to talk about equity, again, is it's hard for me at times to remember, the difference between equality and equity. And so equity to me is kind of like this picture here, where we want everybody who's watching, say, a baseball game over the fence to have the same experience. But the tall person doesn't need as much help as the shortest person. So equity is not about giving everybody equal resources, but instead is to give the resources that are required so that everybody has the same experience. All right, so that's just a little helper for me to remember what equity is about. All right, I'm going to do a quick plug here for Oklahoma Sustainability Network because I have to be the president of that. And as Tate had mentioned, we do serve to connect and educate people of Oklahoma, and we try to be a catalyst for promoting and to improve Oklahoma's economy, ecology, and equality. So some of the things that we didn't that Tate didn't mention are some of the activities that we're currently working on, which includes air quality impacts and climate change are basically two of OSN's highest priority issues. We actively engage with the Corporation Commission in support of their energy efficiency programs, and that would be not necessarily their programs, but the programs of various producers, so like OG&E or PSO, and also renewable energy investments in the pilot project, say, like for the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. Generally, OSN's advocacy always includes discussions of monetized health impacts for cost-benefit analysis. Again, we're trying to promote these green accounting types of metrics. And of course, you can find information at our website at oklahomasustainability.org. All right, enough of the shameless plug. So let's get on to what you're all here to listen about, which is the health and climate change. So climate changes are closely tied to anthropogenic activity. I know that could be a controversial statement, but there's a ton of research out there that basically points to this. And I would like to make this as a point, which is, even if it's not, isn't it still better to try to mitigate those types of things that we can? Otherwise, we're kind of at a loss without anything else to do. So I'll just leave that out there as moving forward, we're going to assume that we can do something to help mitigate some of this climate change. And so we have to assume that we're actually causing some of it. All right, so specifically, the types of activities that contribute would be the generation of greenhouse gases, which hopefully everybody knows trap energy in the Earth's atmosphere, which will cause an overall increase in the temperature in the atmosphere. All right, so this available energy increase, this thermal energy increase, then leads to increased activity and severity and frequency of weather-based phenomena. So this isn't necessarily that we're getting different things, it's just that what we get is going to be more severe and we're going to get more of them. So these greenhouse gases are produced through generally the burning of fossil fuels primarily, but also through transportation and electricity energy production. And currently in Oklahoma, they're actually about equal in terms of how much each is producing CO2. In fact, as I mentioned, this next one, declining emissions from the power sector is actually shown now that the transportation is now matched and is about to surpass what energy production is given. So we do have to consider transportation costs in our analysis because they're important. All right. And also, just in general, multiple studies have also shown that ozone and particulates, for example, from diesel engines, also can have high medical costs, especially for the children and elderly, but generally this is something to be said for all healthy adults. So this is all of concern in general that climate change is going to affect health. All right. So let's focus in now and stop being so general, and let's talk about specifically power production in Oklahoma, because we are a rather large power producing state. So generally electrical power production is primarily through the use of coal and gas-fired power plants, both of which will produce CO2. Transportation is also mainly through fossil fuel use, but you have to remember that even if you're using an EV type battery system, what you are charging with is going to potentially contribute. So if you are part of a grid that's using coal and gas to produce electricity, that means that your battery car, while better because you're not burning gas, is still contributing to CO2 production. All right, so again, we're trying to make sure we catch everything. So the good news is that this is actually evolving. And Oklahoma is up 42% in wind energy for 2020, with new additional wind farms that are being completed every year. So this is a positive note. And for example, we have the 999 megawatt Traverse Wind Energy Center in north central Oklahoma, which is expected to begin commercial operations in April. And it will be the largest wind farm in the US. So there's definitely some change happening here, which is good. Also in 2020, wind power became Southwest Power Pools, which happens to be where Oklahoma draws much of its power from, is the SPP grid. And so this is good that the wind power is now being the major or a major source in Southwest Power Pool. Coal, unfortunately, moved back to the front in 2021, and that was due to the higher price of natural gas. So again, we have to see that economic factors are going to drive what energy sources are chosen, right? So, and that could, again, traditionally, this is the cost per, say, therm or whatever unit we want to talk about in extracting that energy. But we have to talk about, in general, a much broader aspect. So it's also worth noting that OG&E and PSO, which are Oklahoma's two main utilities, have submitted plans for major new solar farms and the retirement of some of the existing gas-fired plants. And that will happen this decade. So we are seeing some change in Oklahoma. It's not all bad news. And, being a scientist, I want to make sure that, we're giving credit where it's due, which is that it's not all doom and gloom. All right, so let's start our sustainability framework analysis, and we'll start with ecology. So coal and gas produces CO2 as a byproduct of fuel burning. All right, and this is a greenhouse gas which contributes to global warming, climate change, and it increases in the weather-related insecurities I've mentioned several times. However, one of the things we haven't mentioned yet is that coal, when it's being burned, also produces coal ash or fly ash, which will tend to contain heavy metals, and the waste is generally left on site in ponds or dumps. So the heavy metals can leach into groundwater supplies. We've already talked about water as being a precious resource. So we have some concerns if we're going to start contaminating it with these heavy metals. Now, it can contaminate the ground or the windswept to the local communities as well. So if we get dry contaminants, that can be windswept into local communities. So it turns out that some health packs are going to be extraordinarily local to the inhabitants. And again, this gets back to our equity question, and we'll come back to revisit this in a second. All right, so that's the ecology side. Obviously, there's some not great things happening there, but we have to, again, still consider the economy. And so again, the current calculations of cost tends to tilt towards using fossil fuels in electrical production. And that's because it's relatively cheap to remove from the ground, and there tend to be minimal refining costs before it can be used as a fuel. So this makes it cheap and easy to get. However, if we look at adding the impact costs, this can tilt the cost of the electrical production towards more sustainable electrical energy production methods. And this would be like solar or wind, since we don't have many dams down here or water that would be useful for hydropower. So we have to include the costs of health and life loss, the costs of potential groundwater reclamation if we're having contamination, and the cost of CO2 contributions to global warming, and the eventual mitigation of the risk and increases in weather-related costs. And there's a lot of discussion going on about this because your insurance costs are going to increase when there is a higher likelihood of having weather-related phenomena. Okay, so now if we start looking at trying to incorporate all of these costs, the costs of coal and natural gas no longer are as cheap, which is the important aspect. We need to reframe the conversation so it's clear that we're including all of the potential costs and not just the ones that have been used in the past traditionally, which is, the cost of being able to pull out and burn it. All right, turns out though that in the economy side, we can also look at the potential increase in our economy, especially locally, if we start to implement, or when we start to implement, clean power. And so clean power and transportation electrification does offer new opportunities for development and economic diversification. Think of this in terms of the production and management of wind and solar farms, have EV manufacturing and the supply chain involved with that, production potentially of green hydrogen and ammonia, and high efficiency products and buildings. So all of this can help contribute to the economy, and we don't just have to talk about the costs. So there are definite benefits to looking at moving towards these greener types of technologies. All right, and now again, let's move back to our equity, because we have to always consider our third leg here, and that is that not all populations are affected equally. And so at some level, as we talked about, the cost of health can sometimes be borne very locally. The benefits of electrical power production tend to be distributed to the power companies, to their shareholders, and to the electricity users, right? Because we all gain something from their production. The costs of local groundwater contamination and heavy metal ingestion are generally borne by those who are local to where the waste collection areas are. So this is a disparity, all right? And we need to make sure that we're including this and being sensitive to the fact that those who may or may not be receiving some of the benefits may be bearing a majority of some of the costs, including the health costs. Right, so if we add in the waste and societal costs for changing to these more sustainable electrical production techniques, it will also tend to be felt more acutely by those of lower socioeconomic standing. So this is that as we start to implement some of these greener technologies, we also have to be sensitive to the fact that that is probably going to cause a price increase. Again, sort of harking back to our economy question, and that cost increase may be felt more by those that don't make as much money. So for an example, let's think about the cost to heat a home. And if we increased the cost of the kilowatt per hour to actually, if we're using electrical heat, for the more affluent, this tends to be a nuisance, right? What's another cent or two in terms of a kilowatt hour? All right, I can't get that coffee at Starbucks this week or something. I doubt that would happen, but that's what we're thinking of here. But if we're talking about those that may be hit hardest, and especially those of lower socioeconomic means, now this may be a choice between buying medicine and having heat. And that becomes a much bigger disparity, especially when we start incorporating health costs. All right. So speaking of health costs, we're going to tackle this through a local, regional, and global level, because local is going to be very pertinent to those people who, us, who are very close to the fossil fuel use and production. But then they will still be affected by regional effects and finally by global effects. And so I want to make sure we're hitting all of them, because I think we'll all be affected by every level of this. All right, so if we look at the local costs, it turns out that if we look at the waste costs, while those, like the fly ash, is in a sludge form, it's actually very slight. It turns out that if it's contained, there's very low health costs because nothing's getting out. It's a relatively safe way to store it. However, if we have spillage from these containment ponds, or we have dry cycles where the dry ash can then be resuspended into the air as dust, now we have bigger problems. So the smaller the particulates, it turns out the higher concentration of trace metals or radioactivity, both of which can lead to long-term health costs for those who are being affected by these types of waste products. Most of those would be local. So lung contamination through inhalation can then lead to the higher concentration of metals or radioactive particles in the lungs, all right? And being a medical physicist, I'm well aware that ingesting radioactivity into your lungs like radon is generally not a good thing and does lead to, long-term effects like lung cancer. All right. So another potential local cost is water contamination. So if we don't have good containment, then we can have leaks and leaching into the ground. And so some of those leaching particles may include arsenic, but it turns out that arsenic tends to dilute below the levels that we consider critical concentration. So it's not a great thing, but tends not to be as big of an issue as, say, something like mercury. So mercury can lead then to fish contamination, which we're familiar with. If I think about 10 years ago, we were talking about a lot of mercury buildup in the fisheries. So we can actually ingest that mercury through the things that we eat, specifically the fish. So that intake through the production now becomes a potential health risk because mercury doesn't leave the body. And so we're going to have a buildup in health costs involved with that aspect of this byproduct. It also turns out that unconventional drilling activity has shown a higher risk due to risk to the elderly, specifically downwind. And it's not exactly clear why, but they were seeing in this one study a 2.5% increase in mortality rates of elderly populations as compared to when we looked at upwind locations. So not only is the storage of the waste products, but the actual acquisition of those particular materials like oil and gas, especially in unconventional drilling like fracking, can and does have consequences, some of which we are still exploring and trying to figure out how this is occurring and what's happening. All right, so that's really at the local level. At the regional level, we have costs and impacts that are generally driven by climate. And so that's where this sort of resides. And so we can have longer heat events, but also there's some analysis that shows that the polar vortex freeze events may become more frequent as well. And all of this is related to climate disruption. And this continues to be new science as new facts come out. So I'm sure everybody remembers the February 2021 storm and that polar vortex. So these are the types of events that, are going to affect all of us. And if you don't have heat, this can lead to, decreased resistance to pathology. All right. So we want to be careful and understand that these types of extreme weather events can certainly cause impacts on health. All right, and finally, we're going to spend a little bit more time on the global impacts because there's a lot more research out there for looking at the global impacts, I guess, because it affects more people. But this is from a paper from the Lancet. Hopefully everybody's familiar with the Lancet periodicals, but specifically the Lancet Countdown, which focuses on climate-related health subjects. So this is a statement directly from that particular paper where they say that climate change threatens human health and well-being through effects on weather, ecosystems, and human systems. These effects increase exposure to extreme events, change the environmental suitability for infectious disease transmission, alter population movements, and undermine people's livelihoods and mental health. So this actually expands out to even more things that we're talking about, including mental health, but also brings into the idea that we have now potential issues with infectious disease transmission, as well as people who may need to move based on changes in the local climate. So the resulting strains on health and social system disproportionately, again, equity here, will affect the most disadvantaged in society. And generally, climate change is just going to amplify the inequities, right? If you can't afford to move and you're just kind of on the verge, you still might be able to move. If you are even poorer, you really can't afford to move. And that becomes a bigger issue of why you must stay where you are and have to deal with the consequences for whatever the locale is. They also state in here as a secondary to the National Climate Assessment that I was giving you earlier in the talk that the rising temperatures are reducing food security and showing in a given month in 2020 that 19% of the global land surface was in drought. Well, as we can see, as we are going to continue increasing these drought and flood cycles, I'm not sure that that's ever going to go down. So we have to be concerned about the idea that we may not have as much arable land to produce food. Again, as was mentioned locally for the region, but this is definitely one globally. All right. Another issue, which I'm sure hits close to home for everybody, considering we are doing this virtually, is the potential increase of pathogens. So globally, we can see an increase in the suitable times for pathogen transmission. And this, again, disproportionately affects those in the low human developmental index areas. So these tend to be areas of defined by lower socioeconomic status. If you go through this report, so here's a couple of statistics just so we can put into context. Malaria is up 39% from the 1950s to about the 2010s. And arboroviruses epidemic potential for the dengue, Zika, and chikungunya types of diseases. And also a 13% increase in transmission for the Aedes aegypti and 7% increase in transmission for the Aedes albopictus. And I'm not a big fan of insectology, but those are two different mosquitoes that are essentially pathogen carrying. So we're seeing increases not just in the potential of having these, but in the transmission and the ability of those transmission vectors since the 1950s. And also, since we've sort of been harking back to our resource of water, vibrio cholera has seen similar increases as the arboroviruses. And those, again, will tend to affect those with lower access to clean water, again, disadvantaging those who are probably in lower socioeconomic status. Okay, so now it's time for your next input, which is action. So what is it that you feel that you can do to help mitigate these changes and help reduce the use of fossil fuels, or what changes can you make in your life that will help to promote your decision to be more sustainable? And let me stop sharing here. We'll go back and get another word cloud here in a second. Share screen. Go. And okay. Sure. All right. So I think it's the same link, and we'll go ahead and get that going. Hopefully we'll see other things here. I'm not sure how two word clouds are going to work here, so I'm going to guess. I haven't seen anybody answer. Hopefully this works. More on that one? No, those are. Want that one? Oh, there we go. Okay, we're getting some answers there. Good. And so we will with the image we can see here. I'm seeing some great ideas here. Got design in there. It's always an interesting one. There's been some pushes towards the change in building codes and design for sustainability. Communication is always good. Education, that one's near and dear to my heart. OSN is primarily an educational organization, so I'm glad to see that there. And voting is also certainly a key aspect. Composting, recycling, excellent. Tesla, yeah, I'd love to get my hands on one of those too. All right. Local legislature, absolutely. All these types of issues tend to be local. All right, so I'm seeing vote as being one of the main ones that's popping up here. So that is certainly true. So voting is one of the ways that you can get involved and try to get in people who are going to move towards more sustainable types of practices. So excellent. Thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate it. I promise no more. I don't think I've got enough time for more anyway, but we'll go ahead and finish off what we have here. Stop the share, move back. And go. All right. So action. So one of the things that I want to bring up is that there's sort of two avenues that we can talk about when we discuss the actions that we can take. So one is mitigation and the other is adaptation. So mitigation, which is the minimization of those types of effects now, as opposed to trying to figure out ways to adapt to whatever the changes are. Turns out mitigation will tend to be cheaper than adaptation. And that's mostly because we are reasonably prepared for the things to stay as they are, right? We've already adapted and we sit as we are. So there's really no extra inborn cost to that. So we've already tried to attempt to mitigate that past risk. So adaptation tends to be large costs, and this is going to get only larger as we talk about adapting to, say, extreme weather. I mean, we're talking about flooding and trying to stem the tides coming up onto coastline shores. These are all really expensive projects to manage. We're talking about rebuilding the entire infrastructure. Again, adaptation is going to be expensive. But we also have to consider the equity aspect, which is that if we rely on adaptation, those with higher incomes tend to have better responses because they can afford it. And so those that can't afford or don't have the means to adapt tend to be, again, relegated to not having a choice. So in general, we always promote mitigation over adaptation, and adaptation generally should only be considered as a last resort. All right, so getting to some of the personal choices you can make. Obviously, you can choose and support activities that are sustainable in your life and in your future practice or your current practice. You can minimize resource use, reuse, and recycle whenever possible. These are always great ways to mitigate your resources and your resource use. Immediate action that you can take includes signing up for renewable energy from your utility. They do offer it. It tends to cost a little bit more, but you can buy your energy. You can buy that your solar or buy wind. Also, weatherize your home. So this moves back to the demand side aspect for both your home and commercial buildings. And this means generally that they'll stay warmer or cooler if the power goes out, but also cost less energy and less cost monetarily to heat and cool in the summer and the winter. And also you can look at driving a hybrid or electric vehicle if possible. And finally, I'll put in, again, another shameless plug, but go ahead and support your sustainability organizations who may be working to mitigate on your behalf. So if you want to help support those activities, go find who's doing them and see if you can help out some way. All right. And finally, I just wanted to bring up some investment choices. And this is because, and we'll get midway down the list here and you'll understand why. But another thing you can do is you can use your investment money, specifically in companies, to support sustainable practices. So vote with your money, right? Who you support, who you buy from, or who you invest in. So from an OSN perspective, we tend, I saw Sierra Club show up there. Yep, Sierra Club is another great one. From OSN's perspective, we try to remain more positive and endorse ideas that tend to be affirmative rather than punitive. We find that especially in states that tend to be, or in areas that tend to be less liberal, supporting those activities that would be better is a better way to go than admonishing those that are bad. So for example, we tend to support major investments in renewables and in EVs and to provide accessible alternatives to fossil fuels. And generally, as I've mentioned before, if you do a cost benefit analysis and if it's done correctly, with all the costs and benefits quantified and monetized, then clean energy, it'll win every time. And so it's not really that hard of a sell. Now, this is why I brought this up. And it turns out that the AMA has put out a statement. So the American Medical Association, again, this is health related, has actually made a resolution statement. And I'm not going to go through all of it here. So we'll do the TLDR, which is that they plan to divest in fossil fuel companies in their portfolio in a responsible, meaning fiduciary methodology, which actually sounds fairly sustainable. So they're going to choose commercial relationship vendors that demonstrate their environmental sustainability practices and seek to minimize their fossil fuel consumptions. So again, even the AMA is making statements about this, but to bring up a couple other ones, if in case the money really talks. One is BlackRock, who's a major investment firm, is now starting to include sustainability practices as part of their considerations for investment or for divestment. And Exxon recently, this is in May of 2021, actually had 2 board members replaced by sustainably active investor firm Little Engine One that would better promote sustainable choices. So this is actively happening at the corporate level, which is interesting and great to see from a sustainability perspective. All right, so the major investors are moving this way and hopefully leading the rest of us to help choose more sustainable choices. All right, so here's a list of references because I didn't make all of this up as much as I wish I could have. So here's, if you're interested, I can sure send you the sources that I pulled from for this talk. And I want to give a special thank you to Mr. Montel Clark and Dr. Chad Settle, both of whom are on the board for OSN, who helped me put this talk together. Much appreciated, as well as I appreciate the invite from the Bridges to Access team. So thank you very much, and I'll certainly answer questions or make more comments if you like, if we have time.
Yeah, Dr. Rutel, thank you for giving your presentation. We have about 5 minutes remaining in this breakout session. So if you have any questions, please go ahead, start your video and unmute yourself and ask away. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and ask a question real quick. So I know you brought up in our second word cloud that we answered as a group, seemed like a lot of people are answering advocacy, voting, local legislative work. I just wanted to get kind of your opinion. How difficult would policy change in Oklahoma be as it relates to kind of fossil fuel consumption, the fossil fuel industry, and possibly divesting from those interests?
Yeah, hard, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of money in fossil fuel production here in the state, and that means that because of our political process, there's no shortage of lobbying that's happening by those industries to keep the status quo. Again, OSN tends not to get mired into the legislative process, mostly because we're an educational organization, so we actually can't. Sierra Club, which was mentioned, is a political entity, and so they are much more active in terms of that kind of advocacy. But this is why actually OSN tends to do this at a slightly different level. We work with the OCC, which is the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, which is the group that approves the payment and the cost plans for utilities here in the state. And so we find that we're a little more effective when we can advocate for looking at, again, through the same sustainability lens, and comment on the various rates and rate cases that are put forward, and desires. And I think they even have to go through to get some of these pilot projects like the wind and the solar there. And we obviously support those types of aspects. Voting is certainly something everybody can do in the state. So register to vote and vote with your conscience. It's always a good thing. There are other organizations out there that are more political, that would maybe be better if you're looking at going that particular direction. But it is not an easy thing to change. This is like fighting against headwinds in the state, as one can imagine. And so basically, you just have to sort of hunker down and continue to advocate as much as you can, as we've been doing for probably 25 years now. So I don't want to put a dismal picture on it, but yeah, it's Oklahoma. Got to be a realist.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective. Any other questions in the group?
All right. Well, sounds like I either answered everybody's questions or I was so boring I put everybody to sleep. I see some eyes open, so that's a good sign. But thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure being here and talking with you about a subject that I am passionate about. And hopefully this motivates you to move out and become more sustainable. So thanks, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rutel.